Attention, attention, this is History Lost in Time. And welcome to episode 24 of the History Lost in Time podcast, this time with another aerospace topic. I will discuss the Achilles heel of the German jets of World War II, the engines. The topic of this episode. When you read books about German jets that were published shortly after the war, you get the impression that the jets were very powerful and could have won the war in the air if Hitler hadn't made stupid decisions like using the fighter Me-262 as a fighter bomber. However, this impression is a bit wrong. Hitler did make his fair share of wrong decisions, which delayed the introduction of the jets. However, he wasn't the biggest problem. The biggest problem by far were the jet engines themselves, and that's what I will talk about here. Political agenda and background. None. I'm certain that I will be confronted with the accusation that I want to diminish German achievements. However, that is not the case. The achievements by pilots and engineers were impressive simply because the engines were so problematic. It is not my intention to publish an episode that basically says the others were better. I want to point out facts that were a bit forgotten initially. The sources that were used. I used the following books as sources. Eric Brown, Berühmte Flugzeuge der Luftwaffe, 1939 bis 45, Berichte eines Testpiloten. Translation: Famous Aircraft of the Luftwaffe, 1939 to 1945, Reports of a Test Pilot, published by Motorbuch Verlag, Stuttgart 2011, originally published as Wings of the Luftwaffe, MacDonald and Janes Publishing Limited, London 1977. Eric Brown was a British fighter pilot and test pilot who flew more aircraft than any other human. Adolf Galland, Die Ersten und die Letzten, Translation, The First and the Last, published by Franz Schneeklut Verlag KG, München, 1953. Adolf Galland was a fighter pilot in World War II and he led the Me-262 Fighter Squadron Jagdverband 44. Die großen Luftschlachten des Zweiten Weltkriegs, Translation, The Big Air Battles of World War II, published by Neuer Kaiser Verlag, Klagenfurt. This book provides the reader with a good overview of the war in the air during World War II. Dennis R. Jenkins, Messerschmitt Me-262, Sturmvogel, Typen und Technik Detail, Translation, Variants and Technology Detail, published by Bechtermünz Verlag, originally published as Messerschmitt Me-262 Sturmvogel, Specialty Press Publishers and Wholesalers, North Branch, 1997. This book puts the focus on the technology of the aircraft. Mano Ziegler, Turbinenjäger Me-262, die Geschichte des ersten einsatzfähigen Düsenjägers der Welt. Translation: Turbine Fighter Me-262, The History of the World's First Operational Jet Fighter, published by Motorbuch Verlag, Stuttgart, 1990. Mano Ziegler was a fighter pilot who flew the rocket interceptor Me-163 during the war and who wrote books about the war later. Raymond F. Tolliver, Trevor J. Constable, das waren die deutschen Jagdflieger Asse 1939 bis 45. Translation: These were the German fighter aces, 1939 to 1945. Published by Motorbuch Verlag, Stuttgart, 1981. Originally published as Horedo by Arthur Barker Limited, London, 1968. This book creates profiles of German fighter pilots. For the post-war part and Soviet developments, I used Wikipedia. Even before the outbreak of World War II, a rocket aircraft, the Heinkel He-176, and a jet aircraft, the Heinkel He-178, flew in Germany. However, these were experimental aircraft, not really operational combat aircraft. The Heinkel He-280 was the first serious attempt to build a combat aircraft using turbines and not conventional piston engines. Technical issues and political personal problems between Heinkel and the Luftwaffe leadership prevented this project from succeeding. On top of that, the German leadership was initially very disinterested when it came to long-term projects that required several years to mature. Initially, it was thought that the conflicts would happen as a succession of short, intense blitz campaigns and that long-term projects would have no value. In other words, A slightly improved version of the fighter Me-109, which would be available in 6 months, was preferable compared to a much better fighter aircraft that might be available in 2 to 3 years. Hitler only revealed his plans to the military when he had to. In 1937-38, he had noticed that the long-serving veterans of World War I that were now leading the Wehrmacht were not really enthusiastic about his plans for conquest in Europe. That was one of the reasons why he replaced a lot of them during the Blomberg fridge crisis of early 1938. The yes people that had taken their places were also kept in the dark as long as possible. Hitler usually revealed new campaigns only 6 to 12 months in advance, and even then only to the highest officers. That means that with the exception of the Wehrmacht High Command, nobody within the Wehrmacht knew in the summer of 1940 that they would fight the Soviet Union just 1 year later. That's why long-term projects like turbine fighters trundled along without much support. Jet engines were built by BMW, Junkers and Heinkel. Heinkel tried to use his engines within his own aircraft. For example, the Heinkel HE-178 used an HES-3 engine. However, soon both BMW and Junkers were leading the jet engine development. Messerschmitt started working on a jet fighter in 1939. The project started very slow, but would ultimately end with the creation of the Me-262. One of many problems was, as said, the low interest in long-term projects. However, the Luftwaffe leadership would have required clairvoyant abilities in the years 1939 to 41 to foresee what kind of capabilities it would need in 1942 and later. Plus, one cannot really blame the Luftwaffe leadership for not putting its faith into an unproven technology that hadn't yet shown that it could be used reliably in military aircraft. For us today, it is easy to make this determination, and it is logical to put faith into the jet engine. However, we forget the many failed projects that were forgotten, but which these people back then were confronted with. Initially, the Me-262 was supposed to use the 003 engines of BMW. However, in 1940, it became apparent that the first versions of the 003 engine produced a lot less power than anticipated. BMW had to redesign the engines. That took time, and it made them a lot larger and heavier. This required a redesign of the Me-262 prototype, since heavier and larger engines influenced balance and aerodynamics. The Me-262 had its first flight on April 18, 1941, but with a conventional piston engine. The turbines were only finished a year later, and it wasn't until July 18, 1942, that the Messerschmitt people allowed an Me-262 to take off with only jets and no backup piston engine. Because during the first flight with both jets and a piston engine on March 25, 1942, both turbines stopped working only seconds after takeoff, and the aircraft had to land relying on its piston engine. The analysis revealed that the compressor blades in both engines had failed, despite pre-flight checks and test runs. The BMW 003 had to be redesigned again, and estimates said that it wouldn't be operational before October 1943. Both the Jenkins book as well as the Ziegler book confirm these issues with the BMW 003. So what about the Junkers engine? The Jumo 004 was finished in summer of 1941. However, the A variant used a lot of materials that were strictly rationed at the time. On top of that, the A variant was more of a proof of concept, not really an engine that was designed for practical use. In the Ziegler book, Dr. Anselm Franz, lead designer of jet engines at Junkers back then, is quoted on pages 23 and 24. He says, "The 004A engine was a development unit and therefore unsuitable for mass production due to manufacturing reasons and also because of its high sparing material content, meaning materials that were in short supply for the time." He mentions nickel, cobalt, molybdenum, among others. So a B version had to be developed. However, it wasn't ready until summer of 1943. Dr. Franz continues, During testing of this engine, referring to the 004B, which began in the summer of 1943, vibration fractures unexpectedly occurred in the turbine blades. The problem couldn't be fixed properly. In the end, development speed was more important than thoroughness, which ultimately led to unreliable engines. Still, the Jumo 004 was available before the BMW 003. The Luftwaffe therefore ordered the Me-262 to use the Jumo 004. Unfortunately, the Jumo 004 was heavier and larger than the BMW 003, which led to another redesign of the Me-262. This means engines and a suitable airframe were not ready before autumn of 1943, and without clairvoyance, the Luftwaffe couldn't know that it should prioritize jet engine development early on. In 1940, the situation in the air looked quite good for Germany. The Luftwaffe had the best fighter in the world, the Me-109, and only the Spitfire was a serious opponent to it. British air attacks on Germany were light and not very impactful. Plus, a new fighter, the Focke-Wulf 190, was ready and had the potential of surpassing the Me-109. The situation only started to turn bad in 1942. The majority of the Luftwaffe was now engaged at the Eastern Front, and the British night bombing campaign started to cause serious damage. However, even now a jet fighter wouldn't have made much of a difference. In the East, the Luftwaffe still had technological superiority, and winter cold and logistical problems would have affected the jets as well. And on the home defense front, the biggest problem was finding the bombers. Here, radar was more important than speed. Despite their low speed, the Me-110 and the Junkers 88 turned out to be very good night fighters. The situation became critical in 1943. The numerical superiority of the Allies rose continuously. British and American fighters were at least as good as the Me-109 and Focke-Wulf 190, and in the East, the Soviet Air Force could no longer be underestimated. Month after month, the numerical inferiority of the Luftwaffe became more dramatic. An infinite increase in air armament and air personnel was not possible, which is why only a qualitative leap ahead would have helped. When pilots like Adolf Galland were allowed to fly the Me-262 prototype in 1943, they were obviously enthusiastic about it because it seemed like the solution to all their problems was right there, a new powerful fighter aircraft which could defeat the Allies. After his first flight, Galland said that it felt like an angel was pushing. Galland in particular later blamed Hitler for the delayed introduction of the Me-262 as an intercept fighter. However, on the day of his first flight, he was introduced to the Achilles heel of the jet fighters. On pages 346-347 in his book, he writes, "First, the factory's chief pilot demonstrated one of the two birds in flight. After refueling, I climbed in. With numerous manual maneuvers, mechanics started the turbines. I watched the process with great interest. The first one started up smoothly, the second caught fire. In an instant, the turbine was ablaze. But as a fighter pilot, you are fortunately used to getting in and out quickly. The fire was quickly extinguished. The second plane didn't cause any trouble." This became the standard problem for both the BMW and Junkers engines. They were moody and unreliable. They tended to catch fire or to burn out. They provided a very sluggish acceleration, and their lifespan was extremely short, ranging from 10 to 25 hours. After half of that time, a major overhaul was required. This is confirmed in all books. The short lifespan was due to the fact that low-quality materials had to be used to build the engines, but the problems with reliability and sluggish acceleration were the result of design flaws. All this was known by the Luftwaffe leadership, which is why people like Ernst Udet and later Erhard Milch were correct to remain cautious and not to put all their hopes into this new technology. The Luftwaffe had already made bad experiences with projects like the Heinkel HE-177 and the Me-210. To make two complex topics simple and brief, the Heinkel HE-177 was supposed to fill the gap regarding four-engine bombers. However, the aircraft was supposed to attack like a dive bomber, so two engines were linked to use one propeller, meaning the aircraft looked like a two-engine aircraft. This linkage was prone to error, though, and caused lots of fires during tests, which is why the aircraft was called the Flying Lighter. The Me-210 was supposed to replace the Me-110, however the aircraft had serious stability issues and showed dangerous flight characteristics. Despite that, large-scale production was ordered with the hope to fix the problems somehow. This failed, which led to a lot of accidents. The Me-210 had to be pulled from frontline service, and production of the older Me-110 was restarted. So two rather conventional projects had caused massive problems. Jumping into completely new engine technology, which showed massive problems during development, that would have been borderline mad. The situation needed to become a lot more desperate before the Luftwaffe was ready to try this. Despite all that, following Galland's flight, production plans were created. Messerschmitt estimated that large-scale production could start in January 1944, and that a production of 60 aircraft a month would be possible from June 1944 onward. However, new problems appeared in 1943, for instance a weak front wheel which needed to be redesigned. The fateful meeting with Hitler, where he decided to use the Me-262 as a fighter bomber, only took place in November of 1943. This was the moment where Hitler started to influence things. And let's remind ourselves about the war situation in November 1943. On the Eastern Front, the last large-scale offensive around Kursk had failed a couple of months ago, and the Wehrmacht was retreating. Northern Africa and Sicily were lost, Italy had switched sides, and there was now fighting in Italy. The Battle of the Atlantic was lost, the navy was bottled up within the Baltic and in their ports in Norway, the skies of Germany were a battlefield every day and every night, and the Luftwaffe was losing on that battlefield. Even with Hitler's wrong decision to use the Me-262 as a fighter bomber, there should have been lots of Me-262 fighter bombers in summer of 1944. However, there weren't. Production of the Jumo 004 engines turned out to be even more difficult than anticipated. By June 1944, only a few engines had been produced. Most Me-262 airframes were standing around waiting for engines. When the Allies landed in Normandy on June 6, 1944, there were less than 30 completed Me-262s in all of Germany, according to the Jenkins book. By August 10, 1944, 112 production aircraft and 10 prototypes had been completed. These numbers are from the Jenkins book as well. 6 of the prototypes had been lost in accidents, 11 production aircraft were also lost in accidents, and a further 21 had been destroyed by Allied airstrikes. That leaves 80 production aircraft and 4 prototypes. 15 aircraft were used by the Fighter Test Command. The remaining aircraft were stationed at the Messerschmitt factory for tests, at Blom and Voss to be converted into fighter bombers, at Junkers for engine tests, and at Rechlin for general testing and training. So even if Hitler hadn't made this decision, probably only around 30 aircraft would have been available as interceptors. In November 1944, Hitler changed his decision. From that point on, the Me-262 was built as a fighter and as a fighter bomber. During the months of October, November and December 1944, around 250 Me-262s were built. But again, one has to subtract a few which were destroyed by the Allies before they reached their squadrons. And again, one has to keep in mind what the war situation was like by late December of 1944. The Western Allies on the German border, Belgium and France, were mostly liberated, the Red Army had reached German territory in the east, the Balkans and Italy mostly lost, the war in the air mostly lost. How a few more Me-262s should turn this around? Plus, now we have to take a look at these engines during combat. It's not difficult to get first-hand reports. The Allies were not stupid. They had known since 1943 that the Germans were working on the Me-262, and they had prepared themselves. Instead of fighting the jets in the air, they patrolled the air around the jet bases and attacked them on takeoff and when they came into land. when their sluggish acceleration was a serious problem. That's why Me-262 squadrons required protection from Me-109 and Focke-Wulf 190 fighters during takeoff and landing. But even when the Me-262s were in the air, everything was ideal and everything was working perfectly. The pilots had to be very careful and hope for luck. On pages 84, 89 and 94 of his book, Eric Brown describes his impression of the Me-262 and her engines. On the one hand, German pilots were justifiably proud to own the Me-262, but on the other, they seemed somewhat timid in handling it. The power levers had to be handled carefully. The Jumo 004B jet engine became erratic above an altitude of 4,000 meters. At this altitude, the fuel pumps were switched on to maintain combustion. Above 9,000 meters, it was not advisable to allow the turbine speed to drop below 6,000 rpm to avoid flameout. Furthermore, the engines could not be restarted above 4,000 meters. In the Air Battles of World War II book, there are the following entries on pages 206 and 211. The new fighter presented a puzzle to the pilots of Test Command 262 in Lechfeld. If the power levers were pushed forward a little too quickly, the untested engines regularly overheated to the point of uncontrollable engine fire. If the power was reduced to idle at low altitude, the engine could go out. Then there was no chance but to land. Restarting in mid-air took far too long and was therefore practically impossible. The pilots were accustomed to their aircraft responding immediately to changes in the throttle. On the Me-262, they initially experienced the agony of sluggish acceleration from low speeds. The fear of an engine fire was constantly on their minds, and the thought that the flame would burn out and not be reignited completely confused them. The commanding officer of this test command, Walter Nowotny, lost his life due to such an engine failure, because he was unable to fight off the P-51 Mustangs that were chasing him. Johannes Mackie Steinhoff talks about similar experiences with the Me-262 in the Fighter Aces book, and Steinhoff was not a beginner. During World War II, he flew no less than 993 missions, and he was shot down 12 times. But always managed to land. He never had to use his parachute. He ended the war as a colonel with 176 confirmed kills. After the war, he served with the West German Luftwaffe. On pages 110 and 112, he describes one mission with his wingman Fährmann. Then my guns jam while Fährmann shoots down another Boeing. As I pull up for the turn, he shouts behind me, "My right turbine is down." Fährmann slows down and slows down. Another emergency call. My left turbine isn't working either, and a lively chase of thunderbolts is already behind him. When I turn around to help him, my right turbine also stops. Duplication of cases. Now I have to think about myself and head for Munich Riem. We are working like mad, day and night, on our damaged turbos. We are arguing over who gets to fly first. The few aircraft we have aren't up to the constant strain, and if we can fly with 6 turbos, we are already proud. So the total production number of Me-262s isn't that important. The number of Jumo 004 engines that are working at the same time is much more important, and that number probably wasn't very high. When engines have to be overhauled after just 10 hours and replaced after only 25 hours, you quickly reach the point where newly produced engines are mostly used to replace burned-out ones and where you have barely any left to put into new aircraft. The number of simultaneously operational jets with Jumo 004 engines was therefore effectively capped at a very low level. And yet, despite all that, the Me-262 was a fantastic aircraft and a major step in the history of aviation. The praise of the opponent, in this case the praise of Eric Brown, is proof of that. On pages 83, 84 and 98 he says this about the Me-262. If you were to ask me which aircraft was the most dangerous to the enemy during World War II, my answer would have to be Messerschmitt's Me-262. It was a fantastic aircraft in many respects, and its appearance in the twilight of the Third Reich was accompanied by such drama that the great Wagner could not have staged it better. In it, one immediately had the feeling of piloting a first-class aircraft, equally suited to the fighter and fighter-bomber roles. Now one might say that the problems were mostly because low-quality materials had to be used. However, Soviet experiences with the BMW-003 and the Jumo 004 tell a different story. After the war, the Soviet Union produced these captured engines under the designations RD-10 and RD-20 and installed them into fighter trainers like the Yak-15 and Yak-17 and the fighter MiG-9. By using high-quality materials, the Soviets were able to increase the lifespan of the engines. However, the reliability was still a problem. The French had the same problem with their experimental aircraft Sud-Ouest 6000 Triton, which is why they switched to the British Nene engine quickly. And, well, the Soviets did the same, because the BMW 003 and the Jumo 004 had led them to a dead end, and they couldn't develop themselves out of it. Despite Stalin doubting that they had any chance, quote, "which idiot would be so stupid as to sell us his state secrets?" he allowed the Soviet Minister of Aviation Khrushchev to attempt to buy a Western engine. And surprisingly, the British government under Prime Minister Clement Attlee sold the Soviets 50 Nene engines, including the blueprints. The British insisted that the engines shouldn't be used for military purposes, but the Soviets ignored that, of course, and the Nene ended up in the fighter aircraft MiG-15. British protests and attempts to get royalty payments led to nothing, except maybe amusement within the Kremlin. This engine was the baseline for new Soviet engine developments, while the German development lines ended with the BMW 003 and the Jumo 004. A few finishing words. When the large-scale production of the Jumo 004B engine began, Junkers was of the opinion that the engine wasn't ready. However, despair and hope forced the Luftwaffe to throw more and more radical and revolutionary aircraft into the battle. The Western Allies, who had similar problems with their first jets, the British Gloster Meteor and the American P-80 Shooting Star, didn't have to. They could work on their aircraft with more calm and care, even though obviously hecticness and accidents also happened there. But there was no need to use these aircraft quickly. The existing Spitfires, Thunderbolts and Mustangs were able to win the war. The achievements of engineers, pilots and ground personnel of the Luftwaffe are all the more impressive since they, basically, were using unfinished engines in battle and achieved impressive results, even though this didn't change the outcome of the war. Hitler certainly played his part in preventing the Me-262 to reach its full potential. But even if he had fully supported the project, the problems with the engines would have stayed the same, which would have led to a very similar result. Thank you. This was History Lost in Time.